Hello, NetSuite listeners, and welcome to the NetSuite podcast. I'm Ian McCue, one of the co-hosts of this podcast and a senior content marketing manager at NetSuite. Today we're focusing on one of the hottest topics of the last 3 years, supply chains. Joining me to share his supply chain insights is Chris Benner, a retail industry veteran and NetSuite vertical product manager for retail. Chris delves into how products companies can counter the stream of challenges they faced the last few years, like major supply chain disruptions and, more recently, an economic slowdown. Many companies have more stock than usual on hand right now, and he shares strategies on turning that excess inventory into cash. Chris then gets into why demand and supply planning is especially critical right now, and why companies that try to use spreadsheets for this are at a disadvantage. The retail expert walks through critical inventory metrics you should watch and how to parse through this data. Chris then takes us through specific NetSuite solutions that can help businesses better predict inventory needs, manage stock, and otherwise improve the efficiency of their operations. He shares real-world examples of several customers who have seen impressive results with NetSuite supply chain management applications. As AI dominates headlines, Chris touches on how NetSuite uses machine learning to assess risk in the supply chain. He also explains how NetSuite pulls together information from across your supply chain to provide critical alerts and prevent future problems. Chris details how the system can make it easier to manage partners like 3PL providers and B2B customers. And he offers a few tips on how product companies can prepare for an uncertain future. Stay tuned. All of that and more is coming up next.
You're listening to the NetSuite podcast, where we discuss what's happening within NetSuite, why we're doing it, and where we're heading in the future. We'll dive into the details about the software and the people at NetSuite who are behind all the moving parts. We'll also feature customer growth stories, discussing the ups and downs of running a company and how one integrated system can help your business continue to scale.
Chris, since this is your first time on the podcast, could you just start by giving us a quick background on your career and what your current role at NetSuite kind of entails?
Sure. Thanks, Ian. So yeah, I'm at NetSuite. I'm what we call a vertical product manager. I focus on the retail space. So really, I've been with NetSuite for 8 years, and really what I do is I focus on our strategy and roadmap as it relates to retailers, and even more broadly, just product-based companies. These days, we deal with a lot of manufacturers, wholesale distribution, any company out there that is, manufacturing or selling goods. Generally falls, kind of under my umbrella. So we deal with the strategy and roadmap. I've been in the retail space and technology generally for about 30 years. Started my career in Texas working for a couple retailers, worked for the Bombay Company and Pier 1, just managing software, managing implementations and supporting those softwares. And spent about 10 years prior to NetSuite at Oracle in their retail practice, working on store systems and merchandising systems. So had quite a few different experiences through those 30 years, but happy to be here today.
Yeah, a lot of good experience to draw on there, and specific to the industry as well, or product companies as well. So as we kind of move into the topic of today around supply chain disruptions, economic uncertainty, all that stuff, and kind of what companies can do in response, I think I just want to start with this question. Given the combination we have today of still some disruptions in the supply chain, as well as that uncertainty about where the economy is going, what kind of the future holds there, what advice do you have for companies on how they can kind of manage through these really big challenges that could pose a lot of questions and a lot of problems potentially as well?
Yeah, this is definitely a challenging one, and whether we're talking about large companies or small and medium-sized companies, we all continue to work through these challenges that we've been experiencing over the past couple of years. And personally, I think it's really important to, when we're dealing with this and when we're trying to run a company, it's important to leverage data, right, to plan for the future as much as we can, and that's both internal data and external data. I like to, as I'm researching the space, I like to look at macroeconomic data, and I like to look at, as we try to forecast and look at what's coming in the future, all we can do is leverage data like, unemployment numbers or job growth or interest rates and inflation, the consumer price index, things like this really can at least give us an idea of where we're heading over the coming weeks or months. And that's really, from a macro perspective, that's really all we can do. I like to, there are lots of different sources out there. I personally like to go, there's an organization called the National Retail Federation. Their website is nrf.com, and they do a lot of research. They really stay in tune with what's happening with the economy, what's happening with consumer behavior. So it's a great resource to go and look at their research, just to see where we're heading, where we are today, what are consumers doing. Some other resources I use are, the Department of Commerce. You can go to commerce.gov and look at data. But I think that's really the crux of it, is leveraging, external data as much as possible. When things are so uncertain, all we can do is, look at all these different sources to try to figure out where we might be heading and try to plan for that. But then we also need to kind of couple that with our internal data. And we're going to, I think, get into a lot of that in this podcast, and, dealing with, things like inventory. How do we manage our inventory? And at the end of the day, all these things, have to focus on, customer satisfaction, the customer experience. And as we're managing through these times, we've got to focus on, the financial health of our companies, and kind of across, when we look at supply chain and the impact, we really need to focus on the inventory position and how that's going to support, that customer experience, as well as the financial health of our companies. And we kind of have to, like I said, combine both all of this internal data and that external data, like the macroeconomic data, to try to make the best decisions we can in moving forward. And, as we plan for this, one last thing I'll point out is, I was looking at the NRF website, and for the rest of the year 2023, we don't know how it's going to go, and hopefully we'll rebound sooner rather than later. But the NRF forecast for retail sales growth for the rest of 2023, they're projecting 4 to 6% growth in retail sales. Now, that could change. But that's not bad. It actually exceeds the retail growth that we experienced pre-pandemic, so pre-2020. So, if you look at that, that's not so bad. So as we're planning our supply chains, planning our inventory, we can look at data like this and say, all right, so if NRF is correct and retail sales are going to grow from 4 to 6%, then, that might help me plan for my inventory purchases. So we've got to use that data along with other data to try to help manage through these times. So hopefully that will be helpful.
Yeah, absolutely. And good to see that, there kind of could be a little bit of a brighter spot on the horizon there.
Yeah, there's some positives out there. So, I try to be an optimist.
Yeah, for sure. So with that kind of in mind, and as you alluded to there, Chris, how does you think the current economic environment, inflation, costs going up in general, as well as maybe consumer demand starting to fall off a little bit, how does that all kind of impact how businesses think about their stock as well as how they manage it?
Yeah, and the stock, it's kind of at the crux of, most product related businesses, and unfortunately these days there are lots of retailers that are still dealing with, inventory challenges from, the pandemic and the supply chain disruptions that we've seen. I saw an article recently. There was a publication called WWD. They published an article that said that the majority of the retailers they interviewed and they looked at were still carrying, in 2023, they were still carrying 20% more inventory than they normally would. So, we've had all kinds of crazy things happening with the pandemic and, the supply chain disruptions, and then a rebound after the, pandemic and consumer confidence going up. So, managing that inventory position is really difficult. And, at the end of the day, again, we've got to use whatever data we have to try to get to a point where we can bring that inventory down, right? So if we're sitting on 20% more inventory, we've got to find a way to get that inventory down, right? Because there's a cash impact on that. But while also, satisfying consumer demand, right? So, if I need to get rid of that 20% of inventory that's sitting on top of what I normally have, do I need to get promotional with that? Maybe so. Do I want to just, try to purge that inventory another way? Maybe there are companies called jobbers that will go out and and buy inventory off of you at a discount, and then move it elsewhere, maybe even across the world. But, do I make decisions like that to try to get rid of this excess inventory to kind of reset for what's coming next, right? It's just a decision we need to make based on, the type of products we're selling and the season we're going into. And so, I think that's a big part of it is trying to figure out, where we are today and what does my inventory look like today based on what's been happening in the past couple of years? What do I need to do to prepare myself for the next 6, 9, 12 months and so on to make sure that my inventory is in the right position to satisfy my customers down the road, right?
Yeah, and as you mentioned, there's obviously a close connection between available cash or cash flow and your inventory. And seems like everyone and anyone is talking about cash flow and how important it is these days. Do you think that business leaders for these product companies realize how big of a lever kind of their inventory and inventory management can be in increasing their cash position, since that is such a kind of key priority right now?
Yeah, I think so. And, in the companies that I talk with, I do. I think they've got their finger on this one. But I think that lever goes both ways, though. When we're looking at the relationship of your inventory position and your cash position, you've got to be careful about how you are balancing that, right? So the more inventory you're carrying, it's going to can have a negative impact on your cash position. So, ideally, you want to try to sell as much as possible to satisfy your customers with as little inventory as possible, right? And that's going to have, a positive impact on your cash position, right? But ultimately the carrying costs of the inventory can have such a negative impact on the balance sheet and your cash position in general. This is where, we've got to leverage modern software to kind of manage these things to make sure that your inventory and your cash position are balanced in such a way to keep your business as healthy as possible and keep your customers happy, ultimately, is what it's all about, right?
Yeah, and I mean, as you said, it's very important now, and it's always been important, right, to forecast for inventory well. But do you think that some of these conditions we've talked about, whether it be the supply chain, whether it be holding more inventory than usual, or just kind of these inflationary pressures, do you think all those conditions have put, could we say, maybe a premium on demand and supply planning?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, demand and supply planning can help companies of all sizes, right, deliver speed and accuracy in their business, way above what you can normally achieve with a spreadsheet. So we see it a lot, mostly with small and mid-sized companies, where they're leveraging spreadsheets to manage their inventory and try to match up demand and supply. And that's really, it's kind of the crux of what we're talking about here, is trying to make sure that we're matching up demand and supply as closely as possible and trying to drive efficiencies into this process, right? So, modern demand and supply planning capabilities, not only provide an accurate forecast of what we think is going to happen in the future based on historical data, but they can also help monitor the health of the supply chain in real time. As we are planning and executing the supply chain, we're trying to satisfy demand and execute on that. But things happen in the supply chain that we don't expect, right? We might have inventory constraints, we might have late purchase orders, right? So a good example is if a retailer has some constrained inventory situations and maybe a purchase order looks like it's going to be late, what do we do with it, right? Supply planning can help you monitor this and give you alerts to that situation where, as opposed to trying to manage this in a spreadsheet, right, you can dynamically be alerted to things like a late purchase order. And then, software can help you make decisions to help alleviate that problem as quickly as possible, right? So it's really about being more proactive than reactive. If you're spending time manually looking through spreadsheets and trying to manage your inventory flowing through the supply chain, you're taking up so much time just kind of chugging through and massaging data that you can't really get to that proactive level where you are dynamically making decisions in real time based on what your suppliers are doing or what's happening elsewhere in your supply chain. And I think these, demand and supply planning solutions really bring that dynamic and proactive capability to businesses of all sizes, right? It's really
Mm-hmm.
one of the benefits we see is small and mid-sized companies are getting the benefits of software like NetSuite is providing that typically product-based companies never had before, right? And they had to do things in spreadsheets because the software was maybe too expensive. But I think that's one thing that's putting a premium on these solutions is we're able to deliver these solutions to all sizes of companies and give them these robust capabilities.
And when we think about what kind of numbers retailers should be paying attention to right now, what are some metrics or KPIs that stand out to you as things that can help them manage their stock better and try to keep as much cash around as possible while, like you said, make sure that they're meeting demand as well?
Yeah, I think that there are lots. I think probably the first couple that companies look at first, and you got inventory sell through and metrics like inventory turn, very important KPIs, right? So these are going to give you a measure of how quickly you're moving your inventory through that supply chain, right? Then I guess I would say start looking at location specific data, right? If you're looking at how quickly you're moving inventory through your supply chain, then if you've got multiple warehouses or a combination of warehouses and physical brick and mortar stores, then you can start drilling into that granular data and looking at that location data. And then going further, looking at merchandise category specific data, right? And matching that up together, right? So I can see how quickly is my inventory moving through the supply chain, as it's moving through the supply chain, where am I selling the most? Do I have a particular warehouse that's supplying more than others, or do I have particular stores that are flowing data products through faster than others? And then I can look at specific categories of merchandise. Do I have hot sellers? Right? What are my top sellers? What are my bottom sellers? When we look at KPIs, I think these are important, right? So these are my top selling items. How do I manage that inventory, right? I'm going to manage that differently than my bottom sellers. If I've got slow sellers that are sitting in the warehouse, what's the problem? Is it a problem with those products and I just need to purge those and move on to different products, or am I not reaching my customers? So everything from things like the inventory turn to top and bottom sellers, and then comparing locations and seeing how they're performing against each other. And then once we look at that data, then we can really get to a point where we're more proactively managing that inventory and make decisions based on what we're seeing, right? Based on my inventory turn, my top sellers or bottom sellers, I can use that data to make decisions on my future purchases, how I'm flowing data through the supply chain. I can also leverage things like metrics like market basket analysis, analyzing what customers are buying and why they're buying it, right? And we can drive intelligent product recommendations based on this, and look at other consumer behavior metrics, right? And making more proactive decisions based on this data. It's really what I think we all hope to get to, where we're not being so reactive. We're just leveraging this data to be more proactive.
Yeah, I really like the point about kind of the more granular data, like location specific and
Yeah.
category specific. I could
Yeah.
definitely see the value of that. And one metric I wanted to ask about specifically that I feel like I've been hearing about recently is the cash conversion cycle. Could you explain quickly kind of what that is and maybe why it's become more of a focus as of late?
Yeah, as we look at this balance between inventory and the cash position, it's such a balance, and the cash conversion cycle is really just a measure of how many days it takes to recover the cash that you spent acquiring the inventory that you're trying to sell, right? So as I'm investing in inventory, how long does it take me to recover that investment by selling it to consumers, right? So it's also closely related to inventory turns. How fast am I turning that inventory over, right? The faster I'm getting that return on investment on that inventory, all right? It's really all about that, right? If I'm moving my inventory faster, I'm obviously getting the cash back, and I can do other things with that cash, right? So I think it's come into focus mainly because there are many retailers that become hyper aware of the financial impact of carrying too much inventory. It's an important part of what we're looking at here, right? So some retailers will actually take out loans to pay for the inventory on the front end of the supply chain. And, what we need to look at here is with interest rates continuing to go up, the longer it takes me to pay back those loans, the more I'm going to be paying in interest, right? So
Right.
that cash conversion cycle is a big deal. If I'm laying out money on January 1st to purchase inventory and I'm not going to get that back for another 6 or 9 months, that can be painful if I'm trying to pay back loans and the interest rates are going up, right? So that the carrying cost here of sitting on that inventory is really really a big deal, and it can have such an impact on my cash position as we're going through these cycles.
And as we start to think about how NetSuite kind of fits into this a little bit and helps with some of these problems or challenges, what specific capabilities would you point to with NetSuite that can kind of help businesses strike that balance between customer demand and the supplies or the inventory that they order?
Yeah, it's a big question. There are a lot of pieces of that puzzle, and NetSuite offers so many capabilities, but I really think the whole process starts, with a capability like NetSuite's planning and budgeting. Talking about financial planning and budgeting and looking at your financials and making sure that you're staying healthy from a financial perspective, right? So once you go through that financial planning process, then you can start focusing on capabilities like demand and supply planning, right? And NetSuite on top of that can introduce automation in both the demand and the supply side with the capabilities that we provide, right? So it can automatically recommend what and how much to buy based on the historical data, right? Then it can also dynamically respond to what's happening in the supply side, right? What I mentioned before with alerts and providing these recommendations, when inventory is running low. We also have capabilities like inventory allocations and reallocation of inventory, and then reservations of inventory by channel, right? And these are important as we're, making decisions about fulfilling orders. Right, we've got to go and find that inventory, whether it's in a warehouse or in a store. Consumers these days have high expectations of placing an order and getting the product, whether it's going to be shipped to their home or they're going to go somewhere and pick it up. So being able to leverage a solution like NetSuite to not just cut a purchase order and receive that inventory and use demand and supply planning to manage that. But then once we have the inventory in the supply chain, being able to react to, what consumers are doing by allocating inventory to the appropriate place or reallocating orders. If I've got, a B2B order coming from Walmart, that might be a higher priority than another B2B customer. So do I want to reserve inventory specifically for Walmart? So there are lots of dials that we can turn in NetSuite to make sure that we're intelligently managing that inventory, whether it's reserving inventory for specific customers or specific channels, and then dynamically, fulfilling orders based on where the inventory is and the availability of that inventory. So lots of different dials that we're turning to make sure that we are intelligently managing that inventory all the way through the supply chain and ultimately keeping customers happy, whether it's the end consumer or a B2B customer.
How did 6 out of the top 7 best performing tech stocks gain visibility and control over financials, inventory, planning, and budgeting with NetSuite by Oracle? Answers at netsuite.com/code. netsuite.com/code.
On that kind of note, what companies have you seen that have really kind of figured this out, at least as much as a retailer or product company can, when it comes to balancing inventory as well as demand? What companies have you seen that have kind of figured out how to do that quite well?
Yeah, we at NetSuite we've got lots of we've got 34,000 customers around the world running our software. But I work with a lot of these customers. One that I've been working with recently, there's a company called HydroJug, and they design and manufacture water bottles and accessories. It's actually a very cool story. That was actually, they started the company a few years ago, literally out of, a couple brothers started the company literally out of their parents' garage in Utah. So when we look at balancing, inventory forecasting. They started out, managing their business on spreadsheets. They implemented NetSuite and started leveraging some of our capabilities. And it really helped them out quite a bit, right? They if you look at their website, they've got a direct to consumer model. You can buy from their website. They also have B2B partners, companies like GNC and Ace Hardware and Shields, and they sell through Amazon. But one thing that I look at, one data point that I look at with HydroJug, once they implemented NetSuite, they were able to reduce their inventory forecasting process from 5 days down to less than 1 day, right? So they back to our comments about, working in spreadsheets, it used to take 5 days to set, the data up in a spreadsheet and manipulate it. Now they're in a more dynamic environment where they're leveraging NetSuite data to forecast that demand. And they can also use, this data within NetSuite to balance things like introducing new products and deciding, how much of a new product they need to manufacture and procure and which channels these product needs to go to. So it's I think that HydroJug story is a great example of how even smaller companies can leverage, these capabilities in NetSuite to fine tune and strike that balance when we're talking about inventory forecasting.
Yeah, I mean, 5 days to less than 1 day. We're talking about 1/5 of the time, maybe even a little
Right.
less. It's not hard
Yeah.
to see how that makes a difference.
And it gives them the ability to, work more intelligently. They can take those other 4 days and, deal with other things in the business, whether it's interacting with customers or, looking at demand and looking at other problems. So it allows them to work more intelligently. So it's helps them balance their inventory, but it helps them run their business just generally smarter, right?
Yeah, yeah. And as we look beyond kind of inventory forecasting and balancing your demand as well as your supply, what are some other areas of the supply chain where you see businesses kind of running into some challenges right now, or maybe not doing things as efficiently as they could be?
Yeah, so we talk about a lot about demand and supply, and when we're talking about supply chain, that's where a lot of the focus is, in executing, in solutions like warehouse management, but when we're talking about supply chain, one thing that I don't normally get into that often is on the accounting side of things, but I think that's an important part of it. And we're talking about striking the balance between inventory and managing your cash and being healthy financially. Accounts payable is a big part of that, and it's one of those areas of the supply chain with a lot of inefficiencies. Especially if you're running your business in spreadsheets or older solutions, there are opportunities to bring some automation and more efficiencies into the accounts payable process, and that helps the supply chain, right? So NetSuite introduced a new module called AP Automation. We're driving automation into that payable process where you can scan invoices from your vendors from an email. You can use OCR technology to auto-populate the data from the invoice into an electronic invoice. And really what that means, in managing the supply chain is, and it helps us protect the bottom line here as we're flowing products through the supply chain. We can take that data in that electronic invoice and we can leverage capabilities like three-way invoice matching, which takes a look at 3 pieces of data: the purchase order, the invoice, and inventory receipts, and make sure that everything is accurate, right? So, if I ordered 1,000 widgets, but the vendor only shipped 900, but they're billing me for all 1,000, this is one thing that normally, wouldn't show up for days or weeks later in a spreadsheet as you were digging through it. But this is, with AP Automation, we can introduce this efficiency where we can automatically alert you that you're being billed for more than what was actually received. So it's really one of those cool tools that we've introduced. And then, obviously I mentioned WMS and the fulfillment process. I think there's always opportunities to drive efficiencies there. There's another case study that we've got. Another customer we've got is a company called Air Oasis. They offer They manufacture air filtration products. They've introduced a direct to consumer business model. Obviously back in 2020 with the pandemic, air filtration was a pretty big deal. So their business grew 300% almost overnight back in 2020.
Wow.
And since then they've been able to maintain a lot of that growth. But WMS and the fulfillment process is a part of that, right? If these processes are inefficient, your business explodes 300%. It can be hard to keep up with that. But in leveraging NetSuite, Air Oasis has been able to introduce some simple processes in the warehouse, things like scanning barcodes, during the packing process, that it allows them to kind of validate exactly what's going out the door, which leads to more accurate fulfillment processes and ultimately to happier customers and improved customer experience. So things that definitely, the whole warehouse management process and fulfillment, the whole pick, pack, and ship. I think there are always opportunities to improve that and bring efficiencies in there, and NetSuite is definitely helping customers do that.
Yeah, and when we talk about automation, one thing that comes to mind for me is AI. It's obviously been everywhere lately, kind of like cash flow and AI,
Definitely.
might be two of the most often used terms in the last several months. But anyway, for specifically generative AI, so things like ChatGPT and these other more advanced applications of artificial intelligence. When we think about that technology, do you see any use case for it in terms of helping people manage their supply chains and overcome some of these problems that we've talked about?
Yeah, man, Ian, this is a really interesting one. This ChatGPT, this seemed to come out of nowhere, and it's just exploded so quickly. But everything I'm reading and seeing, I don't think this is going away. I think we're going to be talking about this well into the future. But just to be clear, NetSuite definitely does not use any third-party generative AI models, right? So I think there's still a lot to figure out, where those guardrails are and how we're going to use it. But it's really interesting that ChatGPT can actually develop its own code. I think somewhere down the road, there are definitely going to be companies that leverage these tools to drive some automation in the supply chain. We right now definitely are not using GPT, but what we have been doing at NetSuite, we for years have actually been using our own machine learning capabilities, and some of these tools we leverage from our parent company Oracle to analyze data, right? So we use machine learning to analyze what's happening in the supply chain. So we drive automation leveraging that machine learning, and we can make decisions based on how our suppliers are performing over time, right? If there's if the machine learning module is monitoring how a specific vendor is performing over the past year or two, it can actually tell you, I think there's an X% risk that this vendor is going to be late on this purchase order. What do you want to do about it? So there's some cool things that we're doing with our own tools, but it'll be really interesting to see where these generative AI models end up, somewhere down the road. But I think we definitely need to be very careful about those guardrails and how how it's being used. But as of right now, we are definitely not using that tool. We use our own tools to drive automation in the supply chain.
Yeah, and like you said, we've been using it for a little while, right? Using some form of machine learning, and I think it's one of those things that people might not have realized, what was kind of doing it behind the scenes, but it was there, and it was
definitely.
hopefully helping them as well. When we think about NetSuite ERP as a whole and how it can kind of just help businesses drive efficiency and profitability through better supply chain management, you touched on WMS, you touched on demand and supply planning, as well as even AP automation and kind of the connection there. Any other modules or kind of components of the system that come to mind that help our customers manage their supply chains better and hopefully more profitably?
I think a simple tool like our dashboard real-time intelligent alerts can help us get there too. I mentioned AP automation, but at the end of the day, it's about presenting business users with something that they can act on, right, to help protect that profitability. So if I can get an alert, from my AP automation module that says, here's this invoice from a vendor, but based on the data, if you pay it, you're going to be overpaying based on what they shipped you. So I think it's tools like that where we can drive intelligent alerts based on the data to help protect that bottom line and ultimately the profitability of your company.
Yeah, absolutely. And moving on to one kind of aspect of the supply chain we haven't touched on much so far, your partners and your suppliers and all these different parties you might work with. It could be marketplaces, it could be 3PL providers, it could be, like you mentioned earlier, B2B customer, like a big retailer, whatever the case might be. But what are some common challenges that companies kind of face when it comes to collaborating and working with all those different parties that are kind of involved in their supply chain?
Yeah, I mean, there's so many different flavors out there, Ian. NetSuite, we've got our own marketplace where we can kind of partner with, 3PLs or marketplaces, provide integrations. If you go out to suiteapp.com, there are lots of different flavors of how we interact with these partners. But I think to answer the question, I think for smaller and mid-sized businesses, it's kind of simple, and it kind of gets down to kind of the blocking and tackling. If I'm going to interact with a 3PL provider or a marketplace or B2B customers, do I need to communicate through EDI, or do I need a direct integration, with this, like with Amazon, right? So there are some simple decisions to make about how I'm going to interact with these third-party providers, right? And I think it really comes down to, once we make those decisions, it's all, again, back to the data, right? How are we transmitting and receiving that data? How do we make sure that data is accurate and timely? Kind of back to another customer example. I mentioned HydroJug earlier. That blocking and tackling of just simply enabling EDI communication for HydroJug was a big deal for them. They are selling at the B2B customers I mentioned, for them, like GNC and other partners across the country, simply enabling EDI communication and allowing them to interact with B2B customers helped them grow their business 380% in just 2 years, right? So it opened up new channels and new customers for them that they didn't have before. And it was just a simple thing. Prior to NetSuite, they weren't able to communicate, with EDI for these different partners across the country. So something simple like that has such a big impact on them. And, there's another company that uses NetSuite that's a good example here. They're called Hammett, Hammitt. They manufacture luxury handbags. And they design them, and they're based out of California. And, they've been running NetSuite for 10 years. But, when we talk about dealing with 3PL or other third-party, solutions, after, using NetSuite, they were actually to, bring some of these processes in-house. Like, they now manage their own logistics. They manage sales and marketing within NetSuite. So, they've been able to leverage NetSuite to take these partnerships and bring some of them in-house. But what that's allowed them to do is, take their business model and expand it. So now they're planning on expanding their business to international markets. And, that might mean interacting with, a whole new group of partners. So if they move, if they start interacting in Europe, maybe they need to set up a 3PL partnership. But, definitely NetSuite can help interact with whatever partner they need to interact with to manage that supply chain.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of connections and data flowing around, and it could be challenging, right, to get that all sorted out. But the examples you showed there really kind of highlight why it's worth it, right? Like you said, it can open up all sorts of new market opportunities, all sorts of growth, if you can figure this stuff out and make it kind of scalable and hopefully automate it as much as possible.
Exactly.
And when we kind of think about how you can address all those challenges, what do you think are some of the key ways to bring all that information together and just kind of make your ecosystem of these different marketplaces and suppliers and customers and all that stuff? What are the best ways to kind of mitigate the challenges that come with those? Do you think a lot of it's kind of choosing the right technology partners to help you?
Yeah, I do. When we're talking about, and every business is different, and you might be direct to consumer, or you might B2B, you might have an external 3PL provider. There's so many different flavors, but I think a big piece of that, and one thing that I'm proud about with NetSuite is, we've got a unified platform, and we've got all of this data in one place, which I think makes it simple. So I think, when you're taking such a complex business model, when your internal technology can be as simple as possible while managing those interactions, I think that's very important. And NetSuite's unified platform, I think, helps drive that efficiency.
And as we start to wrap up here, Chris, just a couple kind of final bigger picture questions for you. So obviously no one knows what's going to happen with the economy in the next couple of years here, but just as businesses try to plan and specifically think about their supply chains, what are kind of 2 or 3 areas you would recommend they really focus on in their supply chain to kind of prepare for whatever, whatever could be coming?
Yeah, that kind of comes back to, being agile. We don't know
Mhm.
what's happening next, but all we can do is use the data that's available to us and try to make the best decisions possible. And I think, if it's 2 or 3 points that we want to focus on, at the end of the day, we all need to keep our customers happy. So, it's all about driving the customer experience. But in doing so, in challenging times like this, we need to use technology to, protect the bottom line, protect our profitability, minimize unnecessary expenses. We talked about, a number of these things. If I can sell more with as little inventory as possible, that's going to help protect my cash position. It's going to help protect my profitability. So, really, it's all about leveraging technology and trying to get rid of manual processes and spreadsheets, and just working more intelligently and leveraging this technology to, make sure you're satisfying your customers at the end of the day, but also protecting that bottom line and making sure you're not throwing money out the window by, paying vendors too much or doing things like this, right? Those unnecessary expenses. So it's watching that bottom line and satisfying your customers as best possible.
And why do you think it's so important to kind of prioritize these types of improvements and initiatives right now, especially at a time when a lot of companies are, looking for ways to cut costs and maybe cut back on their technology spend? But why is now the time to kind of sort these things out?
Yeah, Ian, I think, again, I don't want to beat a dead horse, but I think it comes down to having to be agile. When in 2020, when when the pandemic hit and things started to shut down, the companies that survived are the companies that were able to be agile, do things that maybe they didn't have to do before. Things like, offering customers the ability to buy online or pick up in the store, or
Mhm.
do curbside pickup, things like that. Being agile and having technology to adapt to that was a pretty drastic example. I mean, retailers have never had to react so quickly to such a dramatic economic impact, at least in my career. It was pretty amazing to see, the companies that could react to that, whether it was restaurants and, offering, ordering, online or over the phone, and coming and picking it up. We had to be creative. So I think it's all about being agile, leveraging technology, but again, we don't know what's coming next. I'm hopeful that 2024 is going to give us an opportunity to see things settle down. And, if the economy stabilizes in 2024, or maybe late 2023, we'll see, we're going to see consumer confidence start to rebound, right? And when that happens, it's kind of the same thing. We as, product-based companies need to be prepared to respond to that, right? So if consumers are confident in 2024 and things start to rebound, what is my inventory position going to look like at that point? How am I going to react to it? Am I still burdened with excess inventory that is not going to sell? Is that impacting my cash position? So I think it's all of these things combined. I think it's kind of looking at the next 6 to 9 months, making sure that I'm making the right financial decisions to get me past that point. But then beyond that, what does 2024 and 2025 look like, and how do I set myself up as a business owner to take advantage of that and be as profitable as possible, and satisfy my customers?
Yeah, I think that's a great point to kind of think about what could lie ahead, and are you going to be ready for the the rebound, if you will. And yeah,
Right.
you need to think about it now, right? You can't just
Exactly.
wait until it happens, because then you might be playing catch up.
Exactly.
All right, Chris. Well, thanks so much for the time today. I really appreciate all your thoughts and insights here, and thanks for coming on.
Love doing it. Thanks, Ian. Appreciate it.
I really like that last point from Chris about retailers taking steps now to capitalize on demand once it does bounce back. Straightening out your supply chain and getting the reports and insights you need ASAP could really put your business at an advantage, especially since many believe conditions will improve relatively quickly. Thank you so much to Chris for joining us on this episode of the podcast. I also want to extend another thank you to our editing crew over at Lampstand and, as always, all of you for tuning in. If you want more episodes just like this one, make sure you subscribe to our channel and give us a rating and review. Thanks so much, and we'll talk soon.
You just listened to the NetSuite podcast. Be sure to tune in every week with more NetSuite developments, stories, and insights into the benefits of one integrated system to help you run your business.